Hey up, good evening. I'm going to do a little bit more reading, late night reading. Uh, actually, I've been reading most of the day actually today. But I'm just going to read something from a book I've got, uh, which is a collection of letters by a very famous British author, a Scottishman, who I also admire greatly. Sir Walter Scott. Uh, and this book I've got here is letters on demonology and witchcraft. Now, in this book, uh, it's to behold his writing in a personal format. I've got Ivanhoe here, which is another piece of work. He's famous for. He wrote Ivanhoe, a very famous British novel. I'll come to that in a moment. But in these letters, you know, I get an insight, almost a personal insight into the mind of a man who reflected in his work, particularly Ivanhoe, which is a great British novel. Has there ever been a finer novel written which has reflected that dark and light throughout the British history and the inner, almost tribal turmoils, throughout British history, throughout the history of this island, this wonderful island nation that we live upon. Has there ever been a greater novel that's reflected that? And also the mythology and supernatural element to our history, because there is a lot of that. It's ingrained within us. So that brings me back to this book by Sir Walter Scott, which is not a book actually. It's just a collection of his letters to various people, family, friends, other people who we were acquainted with in his life on demonology and witchcraft, but not just demonology and witchcraft, but just the supernatural as a whole throughout British history, European history, and even global history. It gives me a remarkable insight into his mind, on a personal level, and I just think the supernatural. I'll get to my personal interests on supernatural and horror in a moment, but I just think the supernatural, why it appeals to me from an historical perspective, because in a supernatural beliefs we can almost go back in time to understand people's socio-psychological makeup at that time, the beliefs, particularly the religious and supernatural beliefs, that reflect the society, the environment, the social environment that they lived in at the time. It just amazes me, from a historical research perspective, which I've been reading these books down here today. So, yeah, that's something that fascinates me. But horror has always fascinated me from a young age, supernatural. I'm not delved too much into why, but I think everybody's psyche becomes affected from a young age, and we, as we go along from a young age, we come to realise that there are dark things in life, there are things out there that can harm us, very macabre, dark things. And I think that can be such a great thing if it's nurtured properly in young people, and they're nurtured for them to understand it without reveling in it, without it being able to take over their lives, And I think in some of his great authors, they reflect that, they reflect how horror brushes upon our psyche, as human beings, and I'm fascinated with that. I always have been. Great novels like Shelley's Frankenstein, Dracula by Stoker, some of my favourite novels, and I also think that them novels reflect, some issues which are apparent in a society today, which are being portrayed in as media, and I think some people believe that these have just become apparent in a society recently because it's some kind of conspiratorial indoctrination, by powers that be. Well, crap, it's not. Gender, things like that, sexual philias, things like that. They're all described, subconsciously in Shelley's Frankenstein and in Stoker's Dracula. Dracula puts his cape on. He gives you this image of blood red lips. He loves blood, but he's got that feminine aspect of Nancy Dracula within Stoker's novel and Shelley's novel. Frankenstein. The issues today regards gender, how they're reflected in that novel. It fascinates me. It does, because Victor Frankenstein is creating a human being into it. He's creating another human being from different body parts. It fascinates me, and we saw that in 80s, 70s film, didn't we? Rocky Horror Picture Show. How that aesthetic of horror, how there's such a beauty to it if it's reared right, but it can envelop us all, can't it? It can take us to very dark places, but if it's reared and nurtured, coerced positively, it can give us a tremendous insight into what we are as animals, as human beings. That dark aspect to a psyche. So yeah, that's why I find supernatural fascinating. So I'm going to stop rambling on now, and I'm going to read this letter from this book by Sir Walter Scott, and I just think it's a wonderful letter. It's not very easy to read either, but I'm going to have a good go, because some of it's in Old English, and to read it out loud, it's not very easy. So I'll try my hardest. But it just, I think it reflects wonderfully, the history of superstition throughout his nation. And there's a couple of poetic inserts or excerpts, as you could call them, within this, which also do that, and that's why I've chosen it. So like I said, I'll try to read it as best I will. Stop rambling on, I'll try to read it as best as I will. This is letter number 6. Title letter number 6. I'll not read top heading. Although the influence of the Christian religion was not introduced to the nations of Europe with such radiance as to dispel at once those clouds of superstition which continued to obscure the understanding of hasty and ill-instructed converts, there can be no doubt that its immediate operation went to modify the erroneous and extravagant articles of credulity which lingered behind the old pagan faith, and which gave way before it, in proportion as its light became more pure and refined from the devices of men. The poet Chaucer indeed pays the Church of Rome, with its monks and preaching friars, the compliment of having, at an early period, expelled from the land all spirits of an inferior and less holy character. The verses are curious as well as picturesque, and may go some length to establish the existence of doubts concerning the general belief in fairies among the well-instructed in the time of Edward III. The fairies, of whom the Bard of Woodstock talks, are, it will be observed, the ancient Celtic breed, and he seems to refer, for the authorities of his tale, to Bretagne or Armorica, a genuine Celtic colony. In old time of the King Arthur, of which the Bretons spec in great honour, all was this land fulfilled of fairy. The elf queen, with her jolly company, danced full oft in many a green mead. This was the old opinion, as I read, I speak of many 100 years ago, but now can no man see no else no more, for now the great clarity of prayers limiters, and other holy phrase. The searching every land and every stream, as thick as motes in the sunbeam, blessing halls, chambers, kitchens and bars, cities and burghs, castles high and towers, thropes and barns, sheep pens and dairies. This maketh that there be no fairies, for there as wont to walk and was an elf. There walketh now the limiter himself, in under niches and in marwingings, and safe his matins and his holy things, as he goeth his limitation. Women may now go safely up and down in every bush and under every tree. There is no other incubus than he, and he no will don them no dishonour. When we see the opinion which Chaucer has expressed of the regular clergy of his time, in some of his other tales we are tempted to suspect some mixture of irony in the compliment which ascribes the exile of the fairies with the land was fulfilled in King Arthur's time, to the warmth and zeal of the devotion the limitary friars. Individual instances of scepticism there might exist among scholars, but a more modern poet with a vein of humour not unworthy of Geoffrey himself has with greater probability delayed the final banishment of the fairies from England, that is, from popular faith till the reign of Queen Elizabeth, and has represented their expulsion as a consequence of the change of religion. 2 or 3 verses of this lively satire may very well be worth the reader's notice, who must, at the time, be informed that the author, Dr. Corbett, was nothing less than the Bishop of Oxford and Norwich in the beginning of the 17th century. The poem is named a proper new ballad entitled The Fairies' Farewell, to be sung or whistled to the tune of the meadow brow by the learned, by the unlearned to the tune of fortune. Farewell, rewards and fairies, good housewives now may say, for now souls, foul sluts in dairies, do fare as well as they. And though they sweep their hearse no less than maids were wont to do, yet to of late for cleanliness find sixpence in her shoe. Lament, lament, old abbeys, the fairies lost command. They did but change priests' babies, but some have changed your land. And all your children sprung from hence, and now grown Puritans, who live as changelings ever since, for love of your domains. At morning and at evening both, you merry were and glad, so little care of sleep and sloth those pretty ladies had. When Tom came home from labour, or sis to milking rose, then merrily, merrily went their turber, and merrily went their toes. Witness those rings and roundelays of theirs, which yet remain, were futtered in Queen Mary's days on many a grassy plain. But since of late Elizabeth and later James came in, they never danced on any eve, as when the time have been. By which we note the fairies were of old profession, their songs were Ave-Maries, their dances were procession. But now, alas, they are all dead, or gone beyond the seas, or farther for religion fled, or else they take their ease. The remaining part of the poem is dedicated to the praise and glory of old William Shawn of Staffordshire, who remained a true and staunch evidence in behalf of the departed elves, and kept, much it would seem, to the amusement of the witty bishop, an inexhaustible record of their pranks and feats, whence the concluding verse: To William all give audience, and pray ye for his noddle, for all the fairies' evidence were lost as if it were addle. This William Shawn appears to have attended Dr. Corbett's party on the Ita Sepria Nashal, 2 of which were and 2 desired to be doctors, but whether William was guide, friend or domestic seems uncertain. The travellers lose themselves in the mazes of Shawley's Forest on their way to Bosworth, and their route becomes so confused that they return on their steps and labour. As in a conjurer's circle, William found a mean for our deliverance. Turn your cloaks, quoth he, for Puck is busy in these oaks. If ever you at Bosworth would be found, Then turn your cloaks, for this is fairy ground. But ere this witchcraft was performed, we meet a very man who had no cloven feet. Though William, still of little faith as doubt, 'tis Robin or some sprite that walks about. Strike him, quote he, and it will turn to air. Cross yourselves thrice and strike it, strike that dare. Thought I, for sure, this messy forester in strokes will prove the better conjurer. But 'twas a gentle keeper, one that knew humanity and manners where they grew, and rode along so far till he could say, see, yonder Bosworth stands, and this your way. In this passage, the bishop plainly shows the fairies maintain their influence in William's imagination, since the courteous keeper was mistaken by the associate champion of Puck or Robin Goodfellow. The spells resorted to get rid of his supposed delusions, or alternatively that of turning the cloak, recommended in visions of the second sight or similar illusions as means of obtaining a certainty concerning the being of which is before him perfectly seen, and that of exercising the spirit with a cudgel, which last Corbett prudently thinks ought not to be resorted to unless under an absolute conviction that the exorcist is the stronger party. Chaucer therefore could not be serious in averring that the fairy superstitions were obsolete in his day, since they were found current 3 centuries afterwards. It is not then less certain that, as knowledge and religion became more widely and brightly displayed over any country, the superstitious fancies of the people sunk gradually in esteem and influence, and in the time of Queen Elizabeth, the unceasing labour of many and popular preachers who declaimed against the splendid miracles of the Church of Rome produced also its natural effect upon the other stock of superstitions. Certainly, said Reginald Scott, talking of times before his own, some one knave in a white sheet have cozened and abused many thousands, especially when Robin Goodfellow kept such a coil in the country. In our childhood, our mothers' maids have so terrified us with an ugly devil, having horns on his head, fire in his mouth, and a tail in his breech, eyes like a basin, fangs like a dog, claws like a bear, a skin like a negro, a voice roaring like a lion, whereby we start and are afraid when we hear one cry, Bo, boo, and they have so frayed us with bull-beggars, sprites, witches, urchins, elves, hags, fairies, satyrs, palms, fauns, sylvans, Kit with the candlestick, tritons, centaurs, dwarfs, giants, imps, calkers, conjurers, nymphs, changelings, incubus, Robin Goodfellow, the spawn, the man in the oak, the hellway, the fire drake, the puckle, Tom Thumb, hobgoblin, Tom Tumbler, boneless, and such other bugbears that we are afraid of our own shadows, insomuch that some never fear the devil but on a dark night. And then a polled sheep is a perilous beast, and many times is taken for our father's soul, especially in a churchyard, where a right hardy man heretofore durst not to have passed by night, but his hair would stand upright. Well, thanks to be God, this wretched and cowardly infidelity, since the preaching of the gospel is but part forgotten, and doubtless the rest of these illusions will in a short time, by God's grace, be detected and vanish away. It would require a better demonologist than I am to explain the various obsolete superstitions which Reginald Scott had introduced as articles of the Old English faith into the preceding passage. I might indeed say the fucker is a Celtic superstition, from which the word puk or puckle was doubtless derived, and I might conjecture that the man in the oak was the same with the Erlkönig of the Germans, and that Helwain were a kind of wandering spirits, the descendants of a champion named Harlequin, who were introduced into the romance of Richard Sans Pierre. But most antiquaries were at fault concerning the spoon, Kit with the candlestick, boneless, and some others. The catalogue, however, serves to show what progress the English have made in 2 centuries in forgetting the very names of objects which have been the source of terror to their ancestors of the Elizabethan age. Before leaving the subject of fairy superstition in England, where we may remark that it was of a more playful and gentle, less wild and necromantic character than that received among the sister people. The amusements of the southern fairies were light and sportive. Their resentments were satisfied with pinching or scratching the objects of their displeasure. Their peculiar sense of cleanliness rewarded the housewives with the silver token in the shoe. Their nicety was extreme concerning any coarseness or negligence which could offend their delicacy, and I cannot discern, except, perhaps, from the insinuations of some scrupulous divines, that they were vassals to or in close alliance with the infernals, as there is too much reason to believe was the case with their North British sisterhood. The common nursery story cannot be forgotten, how, shortly after the death of what is called a nice, tidy housewife, the elfin band was shocked to see that a person of different character with whom the widower had filled his deserted arms, instead of the nicely arranged little loaf of the whitest bread and a basin of sweet cream, duly placed for their refreshment by the deceased, has substituted a brown loaf and a cob of herrings. Incensed at such a coarse regale, the elves dragged the peccant housewife out of bed and pulled her down the wooden stairs by the heels, repeating, at the same time, in scorn of her shireless hospitality, "Brown bread and herring cob, thy fat sides shall have many a bob." But beyond such playful malice, they had no desire to extend their resentment. The constant attendant upon the English fairy court was the celebrated Puck, or Robin Goodfellow, who, to the elves, acted in some measure as the jester or clown of the company, a character then to be found in the establishment of every person of quality, or to use a more modern comparison, resembled the Pierrot of the pantomime. His jests were of the most simple and at the same time the broadest comic character. To mislead a clown on his path homeward, to disguise himself like a stool, in order to induce an old gossip to commit the egregious mistake of sitting down on the floor when she expected to repose on a chair, were her special enjoyments. If he condescended to do some work for the sleeping family, in which he had some resemblance of the Scottish household spirit called a brownie, the selfish Puck was far from practising this labour on the disinterested principle of the northern goblin, who, if raiment of food was left in his way, or for his use, departed from the family in displeasure. Robin Goodfellow, on the contrary, must have both his food and his rest, as Milton informs us, amid his other notices of country superstitions, in the poem of Allegro, and it is to be noticed that he represents these tales of the fairies, told round the cottage hearth, as of a cheerful rather than a serious cast, which illustrates what I have said concerning the milder character of the southern superstitions, as compared with those of the same class in Scotland, the stories of which are for the most part of a frightful and not seldom of a disgusting quality. Poor Robin, however, between whom and King Ober and Shakespeare contrives to keep a degree of distinct subordination, which for a moment deceives us by its appearance of reality, notwithstanding his turn for wit and humour had been obscured by oblivion even in the days of Queen Bess. We have already seen, in a passage quoted from Reginald Scott, that the belief was fallen into abeyance. That which follows from the same author affirms more positively that Robin's date was over. Know ye this, by the way, that heretofore Robin Goodfellow and Hobgoblin were as terrible, and also as credible, to the people as hags and witches be now. In time to come, a witch will be as much derided and condemned, and as clearly perceived, as the illusion and knavery of Robin Goodfellow, upon whom there have gone as many as credible tales as witchcraft, saving they have not pleased the translators of the Bible to call spirits by the name of Robin Goodfellow, as they have diviners, soothsayers, poisoners, and cozeners by the name of witches. In the same tone, Reginald Scott addresses the reader in the preface to make a solemn suit to you, that are partial readers to set aside partiality, to take in good part my writings, and with indifferent eyes to look upon my book, where labour lost and time ill employed, for I should no more prevail herein than if 100 years since. I should have entreated your predecessors to believe that Robin Goodfellow, that great and ancient bull beggar, had been but a cozening merchant, and no devil indeed. But Robin Goodfellow ceaseth now to be much feared, and popery is sufficiently discovered. Nevertheless, witches, charms, and conjurers, cozenage, are yet effectual. The passage seems clearly to prove that the belief in Robin Goodfellow and his fairy companions was now out of date, while that as to witchcraft, as was afterwards, but too well shown, kept its ground against argument and controversy, and survived to shed more blood. We are then to take leave of this fascinating article of the popular creed, having in it so much of interest to the imagination that we almost envy the credulity of those who, in the general moonlight of a summer night in England, amid the tangled glades of a deep forest, or the turfy swell of her romantic commons, could fancy they saw the fairies tracing their sportive ring. But it is in vain to regret illusions which, however engaging, must of necessity yield their place before the increase of knowledge. Like shadows at the advance of morn, these superstitions have already survived their best and most useful purpose, having been embalmed in the poetry of Milton and of Shakespeare, as well as writers only inferior to these great names. Of Spenser we must say nothing, because in his Fairy Queen the title is the only circumstance which connects his splendid allegory with the popular superstition, and as he uses it means nothing more than a utopia of nameless country. With the fairy popular creed fell, doubtless, many subordinate articles of credulity in England, but the belief in witches kept its ground. It was rooted in the minds of the common people, as well as by the easy solution it afforded of much which they found otherwise hard to explain, as in reference to the Holy Scriptures, in which the word witch, being used in several places, conveyed to those who did not trouble themselves about the nicety of the translation from the Eastern tongues. The inference that the same species of witches were meant as those against whom modern legislation had, in most European nations, directed the punishment of death. These two circumstances furnished the numerous believers in witchcraft with arguments in divinity and law which they conceived irrefragable. They might say to the theologists, will you not believe in witches? The Scriptures have their existence. To the jurisconsult, will you dispute the existence of a crime against which our own statute book and the code of almost all civilized countries have attested, by laws upon which hundreds and thousands have been convicted, many or even most of whom, by their judicial confessions, acknowledge their guilt and the justice of their punishment? It is a strange scepticism, they might add, which rejects the evidence of Scripture, of human legislature, and of the accused persons themselves. Notwithstanding these spacious reasons, the 16th and 17th centuries were periods when the revival of learning, the invention of printing, the fearless investigations of the reformers into subjects thought formerly too sacred for their consideration, or any save the clergy, had introduced a system of doubt, inquiry, disregard of authority, when unsupported by argument, an unhesitating exercise of the private judgment on subjects which had occupied the bulls of popes and decrees of councils. In short, the spirit of the age was little disposed to spare error, however venerable, or countenance imposture, however sanctioned by length of time and universal acquiescence. Learned writers arose in different countries to challenge the very existence of this imaginary crime, to rescue the reputation of the great men whose knowledge, superior to that of their age, has caused them to be suspected of magic, and to be put a stop to the horrid superstition whose victims were the aged, ignorant, and defenceless, and which could only be compared to that which sent victims of old through the fire to the Malloch. The courageous imposition of those philosophers was opposed science and experience to the prejudices of superstition and ignorance, and in doing so encouraged much misrepresentation, and perhaps no little ill will. In the cause of truth and humanity, claim for them some distinction in the work of demonology. The pursuers of exact science to its coy retreats were sure to be the first to discover that the most remarkable phenomena in nature are regulated by certain fixed laws and cannot rationally be referred to supernatural agency. The sufficing cause to which superstition attributes all that is beyond her own narrow power of explanation. Each advance in natural knowledge teaches us that it is the pleasure of the Creator to govern the world by the laws which he has imposed, and which are not in our times interrupted or suspended. The learned Weir, or Wierus, was a man of great research in physical science, and studied under the celebrated Cornelius Agrippa, against whom the charge of sorcery was repeatedly alleged by Paulus Jovius and other authors, while he suffered, on the other hand, from the persecution of the inquisitors of the church, whose accusation against this celebrated man was that he denied the existence of spirits, a charge very inconsistent with that of sorcery, which consists in its corresponding with them. Wierus, after taking his degree as a doctor of medicine, became physician to the Duke of Cleves, at whose court he practised for 30 years with the highest reputation. This learned man, disregarding the scandal which, by doing so, he was likely to bring upon himself, was one of the first who attacked the vulgar belief, and boldly assailed, both by serious arguments and by ridicule, the vulgar credulity on the subject of wizards and witches. Gabriel Nord, or Nordius, as he termed himself, was a perfect scholar and man of letters, busied during his whole life with assembling books together and enjoying the office of librarian to several persons of high rank, amongst others, to Queen Christina of Sweden. He was, besides, a beneficed clergyman, leading a most unblemished life, and so temperate as never to taste any liquor stronger than water. Yet did he not escape the scandal which is usually flung by their prejudiced contemporaries upon those disputants whom it is found more easy to defame than to answer. He wrote an interesting work entitled Apologie pour les grands homines accusés de magie, as he exhibited a good deal of vivacity of talent, and as earnestness in pleading his cause, which he did not always spare some of the superstitions of Rome herself. He was charged by his contemporaries as guilty of heresy and scepticism, when justice could only accuse him of an incautious eagerness to make good his argument. Among persons who, upon this subject, purged their eyes with rue and euphrasy, besides the Reverend Dr. Hornset and many others, who wrote rather on special cases of demonology than on the general question, Reginald Scott ought to be distinguished. Webster assures us that he was a person of competent learning, pious, and of a good family. He seems to have been a zealous Protestant, and much of his book, as well as that of Horsnet, is designed to throw upon the Papists, in particular those tricks in which, by confederacy and imposture, the popular ideas concerning witchcraft, possession, and other supernatural fancies were maintained and kept in exercise. But he also writes on the general question with some force and talent, considering that his subject is incapable of being reduced into a regular form, and is of a nature particularly seductive to an excursive talent. He appears to have studied legerdemain for the purpose of showing how much that is apparently unaccountable can nevertheless be performed without the intervention of supernatural assistance, even when it is impossible to persuade the vulgar that the devil has not been consulted on the occasion. Scott also had intercourse with some of the celebrated fortune-tellers, or philomaths of the time, one of whom he brings forward to declare the vanity of the science which he himself had once professed. To defend the popular belief of witchcraft, there arose a number of advocates, of whom Bodin and some others neither wanted knowledge nor powers of reasoning. They pressed their incredulous party with the charge that they had denied the existence of a crime against which the law had denounced a capital punishment. As that law was understood to emanate from James himself, who was reigning monarch during the hottest part of the controversy, the English authors who defended the opposite side were obliged to entrench themselves under an evasion to avoid maintaining an argument unpalatable to a degree to those in power, and which might perchance have proved unsafe to those who used it. With a certain degree of sophistry, they answered that they did not doubt the possibility of witches, but only demurred to what is their nature and how they came to be such. According to the scholastic jargon, that the question in respect to witches was not de existentia, but only de modo existendi. By resorting to a subtle an argument, those who impunged the popular belief were obliged, with some inconsistency, to grant that witchcraft had existed, and might exist, only insisting that it was a species of witchcraft consisting of they knew not what, but certainly of something different from that which legislators, judges, and juries have hitherto considered the statute as designed to repress. In the meantime, the rather that the debate was on the subject particularly difficult of comprehension, the debating parties grew warm and began to call names. Bodin, a lively Frenchman of an irritable habit, explained the zeal of Wierus to protect the tribe of sorcerers from punishment by stating that he himself was a conjurer and the scholar of Cornelius Agrippa, and might therefore well desire to save the lives of those accused of the same league with Satan. Hence they threw up on their antagonists to the offensive names of witch patrons and witch advocates, as if it were impossible for any to hold the opinion of Nord Oos, Wierus, Scott, etc., etc. Without patronising the devil and the witches against their brethren of mortality, assailed by such heavy charges, the philosophers themselves lost patience and retorted abuse in their turn, calling Bodin, Del Rio, and others who used their arguments witch advocates and the like, as the affirming and defending of the existence of the crime seemed to increase the number of witches and assuredly augmented the list of executions. But for a certain time the preponderance of the argument lay on the side of the demonologists, and we may briefly observe the causes which gave their opinions, for a period, greater influence than their opponents on the public mind. It is first to be observed that Wierus, for what reason cannot well be conjectured, except to show the extent of his Kabbalistic knowledge, had introduced into his work against witchcraft the whole Stenographia of Tryphomethius, which he had copied from the original in the library of Cornelius Agrippa, and which, suspicious from the place where he found it, and from the long catalogue of friends which it contained, with the charms for raising and for binding them to the service of mortals, was considered by Bodin as containing proof that Wierus himself was a sorcerer, not one of the wisest, certainly, since he thus unnecessarily placed at the disposal of any who might buy the book the whole secrets which formed his stock in trade. Secondly, we may notice that from the state of physical science at the period when Van Helmont, Paracelsus, and others began to penetrate into its recesses, it was an unknown, obscure, and ill-defined region, and did not permit those who laboured in it to give that precise and accurate account of their discoveries which the progress of reasoning experimentally and from analysis has enabled the late discoverers to do with success. Natural magic, a phrase used to express those phenomena which could be produced by a knowledge of the properties of matter, had so much in it that was apparently uncombined and uncertain, that the art of chemistry was accounted mystical, and an opinion prevailed that the results now known to be of the consequence of laws of matter could not be traced, through their various combinations, even by those who knew the effects themselves. Physical science, in a word, was cumbered by a number of fanciful and incoherent opinions, chiefly of a mystical character. If, for instance, it was observed that a flag and a fern never grew near each other, the circumstances was imputed to some antipathy between these vegetables, nor was it for some time resolved by the natural rule that the flag has as its nourishment in marshy ground. Whereas the fern loves a deep dry soil, the attributes of the divining rod were fully credited. The discovery of the philosopher's stone was daily hoped for, and electricity, magnetism, and other remarkable and misconceived phenomena were appealed to as proof of the reasonableness of their expectations. Until such phenomena were traced to their sources, imaginary and other, often mystical causes were assigned to them, for the same reason that in the wilds of the partially discovered country, according to the satirist. Geographers on pathless downs place elephants for want of towns. This substitution of mystical fancies for experimental reasoning gave, in the 16th and 17th centuries, a doubtful and twilight appearance to the various branches of physical philosophy. The learned and sensible Dr. Webster, for instance, writing in detection of supposed witchcraft, assumes as a string of undeniable facts opinions which our more experienced age would reject as frivolous fancies. For example, the effects of healing by the weapon salve, the sympathetic powder, the curing of various diseases by apprehensions, amulets, or by transplantation, all of which undoubted wonders he accuses the age of desiring to throw on the devil's back. An unnecessary load, certainly, since much things to do not exist. It is therefore in vain to seek to account for them. It followed that, while the opposers of the ordinary theory might have struck the deepest blows at the witch hypothesis by an appeal to common sense, they were themselves hampered by articles of philosophical belief which they must have been sensibly contained nearly as deep drafts upon human credulity as were made by the demonologists, against whose doctrine they protested. This error has a doubly bad effect, both as degrading the immediate department in which it occurred and as affording a protection for falsehood in other branches of science. The champions who, in their own province, were obliged by the imperfect knowledge of the times to admit much that was mystical and inexplicable. Those who opined, with Bacon, that warts could be cured by sympathy, who fought with Napier that hidden treasures could be discovered by the mathematics, who solved that the weapon instead of the wound, and detected murders as well as springs of water by the divining rod, could not consistently use to confute the believers in witches, an argument turning on the impossible or the incredible. Such were the obstacles arising from the vanity of philosophers and the imperfection of their science, which suspended the strength of their appeal to reason and common sense against the condemning of wretches to a cruel death on account of crimes which the nature of things rendered in modern times totally impossible. We cannot doubt that they suffered considerably in the contest, which was carried on with much anger and malevolence. But the good seed which they had sown remained uncorrupted in the soil, to bear fruit so soon as the next circumstances should be altered, which at first impeded its growth. In the next letter I shall take a view of the causes which help to remove these impediments. In addition, it must always be remembered to the general increase of knowledge and improvement of experimental philosophy. End. Yeah, so I think that letter by Sir Walter Scott gives an amazing insight into supernatural belief, how how they were considered by people, the social element behind them of throughout history, and it remarks on legality back in even as early as 400 years ago concerning how laws were entwined, as governing laws were entwined with superstition, and how people were executed because of people's beliefs, superstitious beliefs. Yeah, I think that gives a remarkable insight. It went on long. The reading of it took me longer than what I thought it would do. So, because I've gone over a while, I might as well ramble on a little bit more. Uh, yeah, I've spoken about Ivanhoe. I've got a few other ghost stories here. I just love picking these up from time to time. Some of these are really old. I've got this one here, which is Best Ghost Stories, which is chosen by Anne Riddler. Some great stories in there. That's a great one. It's very battered. I think I picked it up from a car boot sale. I know I picked this one up from a car boot sale in 2009 because I've got something written in there. You know, I picked this one up from Hornsey in 2009 from Indoor Market, or a car boot sale outside Indoor Market in Hornsey. I can remember buying it actually. Yeah, fantastic little book. It's got. I were actually going to read a story from this by Guy de Maupassant, a French author, called The Hand. But you know, I wanted to read from that Sir Walter Scott book. Yeah, so that's another one I've got. I've always also got this one, Great Ghost Stories, which is filled with some great authors. You know, Wilkie Collins, Sheridan Le Fanu, things like that. Charles Dickens, Edgar Poe. Yeah, it's another great one. I'll not speak about them. These other two I've got at the minute because I'm using them for research. Anyway, that were a video. Also, obviously reading Sir Walter Scott from his letters on demonology and witchcraft, which I find is a fascinating little book. Thanks ever so much for listening. I hope I read it okay. Enjoy. Rest of your evening. Bye bye.